Well, this is a big day for our church, and I'm excited about the opportunities that it brings. And I've been praying for a week or more that God will use today to bring somebody to know Jesus, that He'll use this as an opportunity to plant on people's hearts their need for Him. I was looking up here a minute ago, and I was excited because I saw these pink and white size 12s, but something tells me that's not going to quite fit my foot. So I guess I'll have to pass on the pink. I appreciate Jacob so much filling in for me last week. He always does such a great job, and you're blessed by it, and I thank him for that. So we're going to continue in our study of Joseph today. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but Gallup takes a poll every year in which they determine the most trustworthy occupations. They've been doing this since 1999, and every year since, except for 1 year, the number one trusted occupation is nurses. Bless you, nurses. The 1 year that nurses weren't number one is when they put firefighters on the list in 2001, and we can all understand why firefighters shot to the top that year. Second on the list this last year was pharmacists. Third, medical doctors. Our elders will be glad to know that fourth on the list were engineers, because I think most of our elders are engineers. Randy's got a big smile on his face. He's happy about that one. Fifth is dentists. Sixth is police officers, and they may have fallen some. They've taken a hard hit the last few months. You got to go down to number 8 before you get to clergy. Man, there's some guys just messing that up for us. You know what's last on the list, though? I heard someone, I think, say it. Well, Congress. Congress ranks last. Now, trust is one of the most basic, most fundamental, most significant ingredients in all human relationships. Without trust, marriages are going to fall apart. Without trust, families disintegrate. Without trust, churches split. Without trust, friends become alienated. The good news is that trust can be rebuilt, but it takes hard work, and sometimes it takes time. And it often requires a surrendering of one's heart to the Holy Spirit. And so we come to this story of Joseph. And Joseph's relationship with his brothers presents to us a beautiful picture of how trust can be rebuilt. This story is helpful because trust is established in this story in spite of deep hurts from the past, in spite of jealousies and hatred and dishonesty and deception. To be able to once again trust his brothers, though, Joseph's going to have a couple of questions answered for him. First of all, are my brothers telling me the whole truth? And secondly, are they truly sorry for what they did to me? And so there's questions in his mind. Have they really experienced a change of heart, a change of mind? And what is their motivation for the way they're behaving right now? Are they simply remorseful because they got into trouble? Or are they truly sorry because they've sinned against God and they've come to recognize that they've sinned against family members too? And are they still motivated by jealousy? Before Joseph feels free to reveal his identity to them, as we're going to see in coming weeks, he's got to know the answers to those questions. And so as we left the story 2 weeks ago, Joseph's brothers had returned from their trip in Egypt. They're back in Canaan. They're trying to talk Jacob into letting them take his youngest son Benjamin back to Egypt because the prime ministers told them not to even come unless they bring Benjamin. And Jacob keeps resisting it, but they're getting hungry again. And so finally Jacob relents, and so they head back to Egypt with Benjamin going along with them. And their mission has a number of purposes. They want to show good faith to this prime minister, who's Joseph, but they don't know it yet. And they want to prove that they weren't spies, as he has accused them of being. And they want to ransom their brother Simeon out of prison. They had to leave him there. He's still held in prison there in Egypt. And they need to buy more food. So as they're arriving in Egypt, there's a number of questions, a number of don't know what's going to happen running around in their heads. Will the Egyptian prime minister believe us when we tell him that we didn't steal that money that was in our sacks? Will he let Simeon go? Or will he throw all of us into prison? Will he give us more food? And understand, they have no idea how these events are going to unfold. So we're picking up the reading today in Genesis chapter 43 and verse 15. It says, "So the men took the gifts and double the amount of silver, and Benjamin also. They hurried down to Egypt and presented themselves to Joseph. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the steward of his house, 'Take these men to my house, slaughter an animal, and prepare a meal. They are to eat with me at noon.' The man did as Joseph told him and took them into Joseph's house. Now the men were frightened when they were taken to his house. They thought, 'We were brought here because of the silver that was put back in our sacks the first time. He wants to attack us and overpower us and seize us as slaves and take our donkeys.' They are plagued with guilt." There's an interesting observation that Solomon makes about a guilty conscience in Proverbs chapter 28 and verse 1, and this is from the New Century Version, where he says, "Evil people run even though no one is chasing them." Guilty conscience. Or as the great theologian William Shakespeare said in King Henry VI, "Suspicion always haunts the guilty mind." They're paralyzed by guilt, and they're fearing the very worst. But little did they know that Joseph, filled with grace, is planning for them the very best. And so on arriving, they wasted no time in seeking out Joseph's steward, the man who had initially been responsible for taking care of their needs the first time they'd come to Egypt. And they hurriedly and nervously gave him an explanation about how this money was in their sacks and they're returning the money, they hadn't stolen it. And I believe that this was a clear sign to Joseph that their hearts were changing. And imagine their surprise, and even more so perhaps their relief, when the steward said to them in verse 23, "It's all right. Don't be afraid. Your God, the God of your father, has given you treasures in your sacks. I received your silver." Then he brought Simeon out to them. Now I want you to catch this. This Egyptian steward literally said to them, "Shalom. Be at peace." And then catch this now, he witnesses to them about their God. Here is this polytheistic Egyptian telling them about the God of their fathers, which maybe suggests to us the influence that Joseph had had on that court. Now verse 24 says, "The steward took the men into Joseph's house, gave them water to wash their feet, and provided fodder for their donkeys. They prepared their gifts for Joseph's arrival at noon because they had heard that they were to eat there. When Joseph came home, they presented to him the gifts they had brought into the house, and they bowed down before him to the ground. He asked them how they were, and then he said, "How's your aged father you told me about? Is he still living?" They replied, "Your servant our father is still alive and well." And they bowed down, prostrating themselves before him. That had to be such a relief to Joseph. But then he allows his eyes to roam across the scene, and he focuses on the youngest son, Benjamin. He's about 23 at this point in time. The last time Joseph had seen Benjamin, he had been a 1-year-old toddler. And trying to control his emotions, Joseph says in verse 29, "Is this your youngest brother, the one you had told me about?" And at this point, he's probably got to restrain himself from just walking over to Benjamin and giving him a big bear hug. Somehow he manages to regain his emotions, and he says in verse 29 to Benjamin, "God be gracious to you, my son." And suddenly, the prime minister of the most powerful nation in the world is so overcome with emotion that he has to get away for a minute to compose himself. Because we're told in verse 30, deeply moved at the sight of his brother, Joseph hurried out and looked for a place to weep. He went into his private room and wept there. I want you to enter into that room with him. And I want you to think about what's going through his mind as his brothers are all here. And as he's there weeping, he's just overwhelmed with all those years. All those years, the years of loneliness and the years of loss, and the seasons that have come and gone, and the birthdays and celebrations that have been missed. But verse 31 says, after he had washed his face, he came out, and controlling himself said, "Serve the food." Now, I love this next scene. Verse 32 says, they served him by himself, the brothers by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because Egyptians could not eat with Hebrews, for that's detestable to Egyptians. So picture this dining room, and here's Joseph eating by himself. Here's a table of his brothers eating by themselves. Here's a table of the Egyptians eating by themselves. And verse 33 says, the men had been seated before him in the order of their ages, from the firstborn to the youngest, and they looked at each other in astonishment. So as the brothers are sitting around this table, it hits them, we've been arranged chronologically. That's hardly a coincidence. Someone has calculated this, and I'll let one of my engineer elders figure this out and verify if it's true or not. But someone has suggested there are 39,917,000 different ways that you could sit those 11 brothers around that table. And yet here they are in chronological order. It's not a coincidence. This is the first time in 20 plus years that all the brothers have been together in one room. But there's only one of them there that actually knows that. Now imagine their astonishment. Because as they've come back to Egypt, they have written the ending to any number of stories that might have happened. From them being imprisoned, to them being made slaves, to them being put to death. They've got all these ideas of what might happen, and here they are, they're dining with the prime minister. But as they're being served, something interesting happens. Verse 34 says, when portions were served to them from Joseph's table, Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as anyone else's. So they feasted and drank freely with him. I'm from a family of 5 kids. I had 3 brothers. And every night at dinner, we got upset if something wasn't divided exactly in half. Well, I didn't get upset if I got the little bit bigger half. But there's a purpose for what's going on here. Benjamin, the youngest, receives 5 times more than the other brothers did. Now, it wasn't unusual in that time for a high official to honor the person in the place of honor by serving them more. But usually this was reserved for visiting royalty. We know, for instance, that the Spartans would double the portion to the person of honor. The Cretans would quadruple the portion for the person of honor. And so Joseph is making an obvious point here by giving Benjamin 5 times more. But let's understand what's going on. He is trying to establish whether he can trust his brothers. And so by means of a couple of tests, he's going to determine if they have truly changed. And the first test is, are they still eaten up with jealousy? Benjamin now has the position of favored son. 20 plus years earlier, they had sold Joseph into slavery because he had the position of favored son. How are they going to react to Benjamin now being singled out for special treatment? And so I want you to picture Joseph. He's at that table by himself and he's eating, but I've got a feeling he's trying his best not to look apparent, but he's looking up to see if he can see any body language or anything that would suggest that they're jealous because of Benjamin. And maybe he's straining his ear to listen to what they're saying to each other. But from what we read here, there's no sign of jealousy. It's gone. In fact, it says, so they feasted and drank freely with him. But Joseph had to make sure that they had truly changed because he couldn't see their hearts in that room. He could see the outward body language and things like that, but he couldn't see their hearts. And so it brings us to the final test that he's going to give his brothers, and that's in chapter 44 in verses 1 to 14. As the brothers are preparing to leave for Canaan, Joseph instructed his steward to give them all the food they can carry, to return to them their silver. But he gives him another instruction. He says, I want you to take my silver cup and I want you to put it in Benjamin's sack. And then after they have left and gotten down the road, I want you to go after them and I want you to accuse them of stealing. Now, when the steward catches up with them, they're so certain of their innocence that they say, hey, we don't think anyone here has done that, but if anyone has, you can put them to death and the rest of us will be your slaves. And so quickly they confidently open their sacks, and to their amazement, to their horror, the silver cup's in Benjamin's sack. And distraught, they tear their clothes. Now, Joseph has thought all through this. He's prepared for this. He had instructed his steward to tell the brothers that whoever had the cup in their sack would become a slave, but they were to tell them that before they look in the sacks. Back at that banquet, they could have masked what's really in their hearts. But this event is going to happen so quickly, they're not going to have time to do that. And whatever happens is going to really reveal their hearts. Now, there's no question in Joseph's mind what they would have done 20 years before because they did it. If they had followed the same pattern of 20 years previous, they would have just let Benjamin remain a slave, and they would have lit a shuck, and they would have gotten out of there. They wouldn't have cared about Benjamin. But this time they react very differently. All the brothers returned together to Egypt to face criminal charges. Now imagine Joseph's relief. Imagine his joy when he sees them all return. Now they look pretty bad. I'm sure their heads were bowed down, their clothes are all torn. But to Joseph, they are changed. Now they're more concerned about their aging father and their youngest brother than they are about themselves. They've passed the test. In fact, Judah, one of the older brothers, aces the test because he steps forward at this point as they arrive at Jacob's house. He steps forward and he makes no excuses, and he does not try to rationalize what's happened, and he makes no attempts to cover up. In fact, listen to what he says in verse 16 of chapter 44. What can we say to my Lord? What can we say? How can we prove our innocence? Catch this. God has uncovered your servant's guilt. We are now my Lord's servants, we ourselves and the one who was found to have the cup. I know I'm reading in between the lines a little bit, but it appears to me that Judah is confessing even what had happened 20 years before. God's got him figured out. And he makes it clear to Joseph, if Benjamin becomes a slave, we all become slaves. And as Joseph listened to Judah's confession, he must have just wanted to get up and give him a bear hug and just cry with joy. But he restrains himself because as much as they've proved themselves and not even realize they're proving themselves, there's still this unanswered question that's hanging over the room. Are they concerned about their daddy? And so the next word out of Joseph's mouth is this, verse 17. Far be it from me to do such a thing. Only the man who was found to have the cup will become my slave. The rest of you, go back to your father in peace. And Judah's answer must have thrilled him, because Judah says, it's a lengthy response that Judah has. I want to pick it up in verse 30. He says, so now, if the boy is not with us when I go back to your servant my father, and if my father, whose life is closely bound up with the boy's life, sees that the boy isn't there, he will die. Your servants will bring the gray head of our father down to the grave in sorrow. And so this is the final sign of their true repentance. Judah is pleading for Joseph to set Benjamin free and let me take his place. And then he says in verse 34, how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come on my father. Joseph now has the answer to his question, doesn't he? Because here stood the very one, Judah, who 20 plus years before had talked the rest of his brothers into selling Joseph into slavery. 20 years earlier, Judah didn't care what the death of Joseph would have meant to his daddy. But now he's broken. He's repentant. And so I step back from this story and I ask, why didn't God just give Joseph a dream or something to let him know about his brothers' hearts? And I think the reason is that for trust to be rebuilt, people have to go through the healing process. And so I want to give you 5 things, 5 points of rebuilding trust. The first one is really obvious, but it needs to be said. Trust is a precious commodity. Trust takes years and years to develop, doesn't it? But trust can be lost like that. It's a precious commodity. Second, and you'll find some psychologists who would disagree with this, but I think it's very important. Trust and forgiveness are not the same thing. Forgiveness is a gift. Trust has to be earned. You see, I could forgive someone for something they've done to me, but that doesn't mean I would trust them in that same situation again. That has to be earned again. Third, trust can be rebuilt. It might be difficult and it might take time, but it can be rebuilt again. Pat Love, who is a psychologist who's written a number of books on marriage and on relationships, she says there is a 3-step process to rebuilding trust, and it goes like this. Say what you're going to do exactly what you say, and continue to repeat steps 1 and 2. Because it takes time. But for trust to be rebuilt, the one wanting to rebuild the trust has got to be honest and has got to be open. Beverly and I have both counseled people in marriage who one of the parties in the marriage has committed adultery. And inevitably in a situation like that, the party who has been offended has some questions. How long has this been going on? Has this involved more than one person? There are questions that they have. And sadly, even knowing that this may be their last chance to reestablish trust, oftentimes the ones who have broken trust will hold back information, will lie, will not be open and honest, and in doing that, oftentimes they destroy whatever remnant of trust might still be left. Yes, trust can be rebuilt, but it requires honesty and openness, and it requires a change of heart and behavior. Many of you can remember back in 1974 when Richard Nixon had to resign the office of presidency because of the Watergate scandal. Now, I've tried, and in my mind I know how to say this, but it may not come out exactly right, so cut me a little bit of grace here. The offense that Richard Nixon committed in having these guys, and whether he knew they went in or if he got the information later, I don't think any of us know. But that crime itself, while serious, wasn't that serious. I mean, the Republicans were going to win that presidential election in a runaway. Don't hear me saying it wasn't serious. It wasn't that serious. Are you with me? The crime wasn't really the greater crime. And we've recently had another story very similar to it in many ways. And what do we call it? Deflategate. Gate has to be put on the end of every kind of thing like this now, you know. Tom Brady, taking air out of footballs, really not that big a crime. But what was the greater crime? You see, I'm convinced that if Richard Nixon and Tom Brady had said, I want to hold a press conference and I want to speak to the American public, and if they had that conference, and if they had said, hey, look, this is what I did, I made some big mistakes, and I'm really sorry, I think the American public would have forgiven them. But that's not what they did. They tried to cover it up. They withheld information. And what they ended up doing was losing their greatest commodity, which is trust. Fourth, if trust cannot be rebuilt, and I'm talking here to the one who has violated trust, if trust cannot be rebuilt, don't play the victim. It's tempting for the person who has offended and broken trust to become angry with the offended party if the offended party does not receive their attempts to rebuild. At which point I would want to tell that offender, who brought this mess on to begin with? This is your baby. Own it. Don't make the other person the perpetrator. But having said that, my fifth point is this. If you're the one whose trust has been violated, be like Joseph and do what you can to help the person to rebuild trust. Be open to their attempts at trust building. I believe this to be a true test, a true sign of spiritual maturity. Because you see, for Joseph, in spite of all that his brothers had done to him, throughout this story, who is the one trying to provide opportunities for them to rebuild their trust? It's Joseph. And so Galatians 6 and verses 1 and 2, Paul writes, brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. But watch yourselves, or you also may be tempted. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. And so we've got 350 people here today. In this room right now, I have no doubt there are people who are living stressed because of broken trust. Perhaps you're the one who has broken trust. And if you are, I would really encourage you today to not do what Joseph's brothers did. They lived 20 plus years with the burden of guilt and anxiety hanging over them about what they had done, instead of just being open and honest and coming clean about it. And that's a burden that's really hard to carry. It can destroy a life. So I would encourage you, if you're in that situation, to do what you can to begin the journey of rebuilding trust. Or maybe you're the one whose trust has been violated. And if that's where you find yourself, I want to encourage you to ask God to help you to be a forgiver, to help you to get rid of your anger and your pride and your resentment. And do what you can to help the one who has hurt you to begin the process of rebuilding trust. Because Paul said in Romans 14 and verse 19, let us therefore make every effort. Let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace and to mutual edification. So we're going to sing a song of invitation this morning. And if you need to come and ask for prayers to help you in this healing process, or maybe you want to take it to an elder and his wife in room 102 and share that with them in a prayer, or let them pray over you, I want to encourage you to come do that today. And I'm really praying that someone is here today that doesn't know Jesus and wants to begin a relationship with Him. And man, we're standing right here and we're ready. We're ready to take you up into the waters of baptism, to be initiated into that walk and begin your life with Jesus. So let's stand together as Jacob comes to lead.